Mrs. Peters went to the back of the room to hang up the fur tippet that she was wearing. A moment later, she exclaimed, "Why, she was piecing a quilt," and held up a large sewing basket piled high with quilt pieces. Mrs. Hale spread some of the blocks on the table. "Oh, it's a log cabin pattern," she said, putting several of them together. "Oh, pretty, isn't it?" They were so engaged with the quilt that they did not hear the footsteps on the stairs. Just as the stair door opened, Mrs. Hale was saying, "Do you suppose she was going to quilt it or just knot it?" The sheriff threw up his hands. They wonder whether she was going to quilt it or just knot it. There was a laugh for the ways of women, a warming of hands over the stove, and then the county attorney said briskly, "Well, let's go right to the barn and get that cleared up." "I don't see as there's anything so strange," Mrs. Hale said resentfully after the outside door had closed on the three men. "Our taking up our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence. I don't see as there's anything to laugh about." "Well, of course they've got awful important things on their minds," said the sheriff's wife apologetically. They returned to an inspection of the blocks for the quilt. Mrs. Hale was looking at the fine, even sewing and preoccupied with thoughts of the woman who had done that sewing, when she heard the sheriff's wife say in a queer tone, "Why, look at this one." She turned to take the block held out to her. "The sewing," said Mrs. Peters in a troubled way. "All the rest of them have been so nice and even, but this one, well, it looks as if she didn't know what she was about." Their eyes met. Something flashed to life, passed between them, and then, as if with an effort, they seemed to pull away from each other. A moment, Mrs. Hale sat there, her hands folded over that sewing which was so unlike all the rest of the sewing. And then she had pulled a knot and drawn the threads. "Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale?" asked the sheriff's wife, startled. "Oh, just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good," said Mrs. Hale mildly. "Well, I don't think we ought to touch things," Mrs. Peters said a little helplessly. "I'll just finish up this end," answered Mrs. Hale, still in that mild, matter-of-fact fashion. She threaded a needle and started to replace bad sewing with good. For a little while she sewed in silence, and then in that thin, timid voice she heard, "Mrs. Hale?" "Yes, Mrs. Peters?" "What do you suppose that she was so nervous about?" "Oh, I don't know," said Mrs. Hale, as if dismissing a thing not important enough to spend much time on. "I don't know if she was nervous. I sew awful queer sometimes when I'm just tired." She cut a thread and out of the corner of her eye looked up at Mrs. Peters. The small, lean face of the sheriff's wife seemed to have tightened up. Her eyes had that look of peering into something. But the next moment she moved and said, in her thin, indecisive way, "Well, I must get these clothes wrapped. They may be through sooner than we think. I wonder where I could find a piece of paper and a string." "In that cupboard, maybe?" suggested Mrs. Hale after a glance around. One piece of the crazy sewing remained unripped. Mrs. Peters' back turned. Martha Hale now scrutinized that piece, compared it with the dainty, accurate sewing of the other blocks. The difference was startling. Holding this block made her feel queer, as if the distracted thoughts of the woman who had perhaps turned to it to try to quiet herself were communicating themselves to her. Mrs. Peters' voice roused her. "Here's a bird cage," she said. "Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale?" "Well, I don't know whether she did or not." She turned to look at the cage Mrs. Peters was holding up. "I've not been here in so long," she sighed. "There was a man round last year selling canaries cheap, but I don't know if she took one. Maybe she did. She used to sing real pretty herself." Mrs. Peters looked around the kitchen. "It seems kind of funny to think of a bird here." She half laughed, an attempt to put up a barrier. "She must have had one, or why would she have a cage? I wonder what happened to it." "I suppose maybe the cat got it," suggested Mrs. Hale, resuming her sewing. "Oh, no, she didn't have a cat. She's got that feeling that some people have about cats, being afraid of them. When they brought her to our house yesterday, my cat got into the room, and she was real upset and asked me to take it out." My sister Bessie was like that, laughed Mrs. Hale. The sheriff's wife did not reply. The silence made Mrs. Hale turn around. Mrs. Peters was examining the bird cage. "Look at this door," she said slowly. "It's broke. One hinge has been pulled apart." Mrs. Hale came nearer. "It looks as if someone must have been rough with it." Again their eyes met, startled, questioning, apprehensive. For a moment neither spoke nor stirred. Then Mrs. Hale, turning away, said brusquely, "If they're going to find any evidence, I wish they'd be about it. I don't like this place." "Well, I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale." Mrs. Peters put the birdcage on the table and sat down. "It would be lonesome for me, sitting here alone." "Yes, it would, wouldn't it?" agreed Mrs. Hale, a certain determined naturalness in her voice. She picked up the sewing, but now it dropped in her lap, and she murmured in a different voice, "But I tell you what I do wish, Mrs. Peters. I wish that I had come over sometimes when she was here. I wish I had." "Well, but of course you were awful busy, Mrs. Hale, your house and your children." "I could have come," retorted Mrs. Hale shortly. "I stayed away because it weren't cheerful, and that's why I ought to have come. She looked around. "I've never liked this place. Maybe it's down in a hollow and you don't see the road because, well, I don't know what it is, but it's a lonesome place, and it always was. I wish I'd come over to see Minnie Foster sometimes. I can see now." And she did not put it into words. "Well, you mustn't reproach yourself," counseled Mrs. Peters. "Somehow we just don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up." "Not having children makes less work," mused Mrs. Hale after a silence, "but it makes a quiet house. And Wright out to work all day and no company when he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters?" "Oh, not to know him. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man." "Yeah, good," conceded John Wright's neighbor grimly. "He didn't drink, and he kept his word as well as most, I guess, and paid his debts, but he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters, just to pass the time of day with him." She stopped and shivered a little, like a raw wind that gets to the bone. Her eye fell upon the cage on the table before her, and she added almost bitterly, "I should think she would have wanted a bird." Suddenly she leaned forward, looking intently at the cage. "What do you suppose went wrong with it?" "I don't know," returned Mrs. Peters, "unless it got sick and died." But after she said it, she reached over and swung the broken door. Both women watched it as if somehow held by it. "You didn't know her?" Mrs. Hale asked, a gentler note in her voice. "Oh, not till they brought her in yesterday," said the sheriff's wife. "She, come to think of it, she was kind of like a bird herself. Real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change." That held her for a long time. Finally, as if struck with a happy thought and relieved to get back to everyday things, she exclaimed, "Well, I tell you what, Miss Peters, why don't you take that quilt in with you? It might take up her mind." "Well, I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale," agreed the sheriff's wife, as if she too were glad to come into the atmosphere of a simple kindness. "There couldn't possibly be any objection to that, could there? Now, just what will I take? I wonder if her patches are in here and her things." They turned to the sewing basket. "Well, here's some red," said Mrs. Hale, bringing out a roll of cloth. Underneath that was a box. "Oh, here, maybe. Her scissors are in here, and her things." And she held it up. What a pretty box. I warrant it was something that she had a long time ago when she was a girl. She held it in her hand a moment, and then, with a little sigh, opened it. Instantly, her hand went to her nose. "Why?" Mrs. Peters drew nearer and then turned away. "There's something wrapped up in this piece of silk," faltered Mrs. Hale. "This isn't her scissors," said Mrs. Peters in a shrinking voice. Her hand not steady, Mrs. Hale raised the piece of silk. "Oh, Mrs. Peters," she cried, "it's—" Mrs. Peters bent closer. "It's the bird," she whispered. "But Mrs. Peters," cried Mrs. Hale. "Look at it. It's neck. Look at his neck. It's all other side, too." She held the box away from her. The sheriff's wife again bent closer. "Somebody wrung its neck," said she in a voice that was slow and deep. And then again the eyes of the two women met, this time clung together in a look of dawning comprehension, of growing horror. Mrs. Peters looked from the dead bird to the broken door of the cage. Again their eyes met, and just then there was a sound at the outside door. Mrs. Hale slipped the box under the quilt pieces in the basket and sank again into the chair before it. Mrs. Peters stood holding to the table. The county attorney and the sheriff came in from the outside. "Well, ladies," said the county attorney, as one turning from serious things to little pleasantries, "have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or knot it?" "We think," began the sheriff's wife in a flurried voice, "that she was going to knot it." He was too preoccupied to notice the change that came into her voice on that last. "Well, that's very interesting, I'm sure," he said tolerantly. He caught sight of the bird cage. "Oh, has the bird flown?" "We think the cat got it," said Mrs. Hale in a voice curiously even. He was walking up and down as if thinking something out. "Is there a cat?" he said absently. Mrs. Hale shot a look up at the sheriff's wife. "Well, not now," said Mrs. Peters. "They're superstitious, you know. They leave." She sank into her chair. The county attorney did not heed her. "No sign at all of anyone having come in from the outside," he said to Peters in the manner of continuing an interrupted conversation. "Their own rope. Let's go upstairs again and go over it piece by piece. It would have to have been someone who just knew them." And the stair door closed behind them and their voices were lost. The two women sat motionless, not looking at each other, but as if peering into something and at the same time holding back. When they spoke now, it was as if they were both afraid of what they were saying, but as if they could not help saying it. "She liked the bird," said Martha Hale, low and slowly. "She was going to bury it in that pretty box." "When I was a girl," said Mrs. Peters under her breath, "my kitten, there was a boy who took a hatchet, and before my eyes, before I could get there," and she covered her face for an instant, "if they hadn't held me back, I would have—" She caught herself, looked upstairs where footsteps were heard, and finished weakly, "Hurt him." Then they sat without speaking or moving. "I wonder how it would seem," Mrs. Hale at last began, as if feeling her way over strange ground, never to have any children around. Her eyes made a slow sweep of the kitchen, as if seeing what that kitchen had meant through all the years. "No, Wright wouldn't like the bird," she said after that, "a thing that sang. She used to sing. He killed that too." Her voice tightened. Mrs. Peters moved uneasily. "Of course we don't know who killed the bird." "I knew John Wright," was Mrs. Hale's answer. "It was an awful thing done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale," said the sheriff's wife. "Killing a man while he slept, slipping a thing around his neck like that and choking the life out of him." Mrs. Hale's hand went out to the bird cage. "His neck. Choked the life out of him." "We don't know who killed him," whispered Mrs. Peters wildly. "We don't know." Mrs. Hale was not moved. If there had been years and years of nothing, and then a bird to sing to you, it would be awful still after that bird was still. It was as if something within her, not herself, had spoken, as if it found in Mrs. Peters something that she did not know as herself. "I know what stillness is," she said in a queer, monotonous voice. "When we homesteaded in Dakota, after my first baby died, and he was 2 years old, and with me no other then." Mrs. Hale stirred. "How soon do you suppose they'll be through looking for evidence?" "I know what stillness is," repeated Mrs. Peters in just that same way. And then she too pulled back. "The law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale," she said in her tight little way. "I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster," was the answer, "when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang." The picture of that girl, the fact that she had lived neighbor to that girl for 20 years and had let her die for lack of life, was suddenly more than she could bear. "Oh, I wish that I had come over once in a while," she cried. "That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that?" "We mustn't take on," said Mrs. Peters with a frightened look toward the stairs. "I might have known that she needed help. I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We lived close together, and we lived far apart. We all go through the same things. It's just a different kind of the same thing. If it weren't, why would you and I understand? Why do we know what we know this minute?" She dashed her hand across her eyes, and then seeing the jar of fruit on the table, she reached for it and choked out, "If I was you, I would tell her tell her it's all right, all of it. Here, take this in and prove it to her. I mean, she may never know whether it was broke or not." She turned away. Mrs. Peters reached out for the bottle of fruit as if she were glad to take it, as if touching a familiar thing, having something to do, could keep her from something else. She got up, looked about for something to wrap the fruit in, took a petticoat from the pile of clothes that she had brought from the front room, and nervously started winding that round the bottle. "My," she began in a high, false voice, "it's a good thing that the men couldn't hear us. Getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary." She hurried over that, as if that could have anything to do with, well, my, wouldn't they laugh? Footsteps were heard on the stairs. "Maybe they would," muttered Mrs. Hale. "Maybe they wouldn't." "No, Peters," said the county attorney incisively, "it's all perfectly clear, except her reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. If there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing that would connect up with the clumsy way of doing it." In a covert way, Mrs. Hale looked at Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Peters was looking at her. Quickly, they looked away from each other. The outer door opened, and Mr. Hale came in. "I got the team around now," he said. "Pretty cold out there." "I'm going to stay here a while by myself," the county attorney suddenly announced. "You can send Frank out for me, can't you?" he asked the sheriff. "I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better." Again, for one brief moment, the two women's eyes found one another. The sheriff came up to the table. "Do you want to see what Mrs. Peters was going to take in?" The county attorney picked up the apron. He laughed. "Well, I guess they're not very dangerous things that the ladies have picked out." Mrs. Hale's hand was on the sewing basket in which the box was concealed. She felt that she ought to take her hand off the basket. She did not seem able to. He picked up one of the quilt blocks which she had piled on the cover of the box. Her eyes felt like fire. She had a feeling that if he took up the basket, she would snatch it from him. But he did not take it up. With another little laugh, he turned away, saying, "No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. You ever think of that, Mrs. Peters?" Mrs. Peters was standing beside the table. Mrs. Hale shot a look up at her, but she could not see her face. Mrs. Peters had turned away. When she spoke, her voice was muffled. "Not just that way," she said. "Married to the law," chuckled Mrs. Peters' husband. He moved toward the door into the front room and said to the county attorney, I just want you to come in here a minute, George. We ought to take a look at those windows." Windows," said the county attorney scoffingly. "We'll be right out, Mr. Hale," said the sheriff to the farmer who was still waiting by the door. Hale went to look after the horses. The sheriff followed the county attorney into the other room. Again, for one moment, the two women were alone in that kitchen. Martha Hale sprang up, her hands tight together, looking at that other woman with whom it rested. At first, she could not see her eyes, for the sheriff's wife had not turned back since she'd turned away at that suggestion of being married to the law. But now Mrs. Hale made her turn back. Her eyes made her turn back. Slowly, unwillingly, Mrs. Peters turned her head until her eyes met the eyes of the other woman. There was a moment when they held each other in a steady, burning look in which there was no evasion nor flinching. And then Martha Hale's eyes pointed the way to the basket in which was hidden the thing that would make certain the conviction of the other woman, that woman who was not there and yet who had been there with them all through the hour. For a moment, Mrs. Peters did not move. And then she did it. With a rush forward, she threw back the quilt pieces, got the box, tried to put it in her handbag. It was too big. Desperately, she opened it, started to take the bird out, but there she broke. She could not touch the bird. She stood helpless, foolish. There was a sound of a knob turning in the inner door. Martha Hale snatched the box from the sheriff's wife and got it into the pocket of her big coat, just as the sheriff and the county attorney came back into the kitchen. "Well, Henry," said the county attorney facetiously, "at least we found out that she was not going to quilt it. She was going to, what was it you called it, ladies?" Mrs. Hale's hand was against the pocket of her coat. "We call it knot it, Mr. Henderson."